Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It's been a couple of days since I've done an episode on the Chris Watts case. This has actually been on my mind for a while. I wanted to put a lot of effort into this particular episode, but in the end I think it's not going to be quite as long and as detailed as I meant for it to be. I do want to challenge you guys. I want to test your knowledge of the Watts case. If you think that you've got almost expert knowledge on the case, if you think that you know the case back to front, inside out, forwards and backwards, whatever, I've got a question for you. And the question is, how many Hold Me Tight books were there in the story? Was there one? Was there two? Were there more than two books? And you can leave your answers in the comments. It'll be interesting to see what you guys say. I'm also going to tell you guys a bit about tomorrow's live, what it'll be about and what I plan to do with that. But in this episode, we're going to deal with Girl Wash Your Face, the book, and the author. The author is obviously Rachel Hollis. It was the book that Shan'ann's best friend, Nicole Atkinson, that was the book that she was reading while they went on that trip to Arizona. Meanwhile, Shan'ann was actually reading something else. But the question does remain, how helpful were these self-help books? And I think it could have been Jimmy Kimmel, but someone was making a joke that how is self-help when you are reading a book by someone else? I mean, how are you helping yourself when you're reading? The first thing you do to help yourself is going to someone else, going to an author. So we're going to talk briefly about Sue Johnson and emotional-based therapy, and then we're going to deal with Rachel Hollis, but in a slightly different way. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. Okay, so we're going to deal with Sue Johnson first, not to be confused with Sue Johnston, who I think is a celebrity. On the 7th of February 2014, an article appeared in the New York Times, Love in the Time of Neuroscience, and basically deals with emotional focused therapy, which I think is basically an invention of Sue Johnson. I guess you could also say that she draws on the work of the psychiatrist John Bowlby, who's basically the father of attachment theory. But this is something that came out in the 60s and 70s, also something that was developed by the psychologist Mary Ainsworth. But basically what it comes down to is that they developed the idea that children develop one of three styles of attachment, and they carry this into their adult relationship. So basically that your attachment psychology is starts as a child, right? And what they say is that secure individuals grow up knowing they can count on their primary caregivers, right? So when they are children, they know that they can count on their parents. So when they become adults, they know that they can count on their partners, right? They don't obsessively worry that they're going to be abandoned by their partners, right? So that's secure children growing into secure individuals. The article points out that if one's primary childhood caregiver is inattentive or unpredictable or abusive, I think another word for that is neglectful, then the individual forms one of two insecure attachment styles, right? And so you develop this insecurity with your parents. Now, what I want to do is take it into the Watts case and say, did Shan'ann have attentive parents? Did Shan'ann have predictable parents? Did Shan'ann have caregivers that were there for her? And I don't really want to answer that question for you. I think you can think about it on your own time. But there was a school teacher who I think was interviewed on HLN by Ashley Banfield, and I think he was also quoted in a book by John Glatt, just saying that Shan'ann was not happy at home when she was a teenager. So from that, you just get the impression that something wasn't quite right at home. And I mean, let's face it, many people don't have perfect home lives, but something seemed to be not quite right with Shan'ann. And so if you take Chris Watts in that sense and you say, was Chris Watts getting the care that he needed? Were his parents inattentive, unpredictable, or abusive? I don't really get that sense. I don't really get the sense that there was that going on. What do you guys think? Do you get the feeling that Chris Watts was an anxious adult because he was an anxious child? I don't get that sense. Do you get the sense that Shan'ann was an anxious child and that made her an anxious adult? Of course, there are other factors at play as well, such as her health, right? Anyway, the article goes on to say that anxious individuals worry constantly that they will be abandoned, right? I don't know, do you think that Chris Watts worried that he would be abandoned? I don't get that sense. Do you think Shan'ann worried that she would be abandoned? I think you get a little bit of a sense of that in the last couple of months of her life. And so, you do get the sense that she was clinging to her partner when he was trying to extricate himself from that relationship. She was seeking reassurance when he was saying, well, I don't want the baby and I don't think we're compatible. And then it refers to anxious individuals and avoidant individuals. Now, the avoidant individual does feel a little bit like Chris Watts, where it says they eschew deep connections to protect themselves from being dependent. Do you think that is a description for Chris Watts? I don't know, because if you look at his relationship with Kissinger, that seemed like a deep connection. It seemed like, she apparently gave him the key to her apartment. It seemed like the relationship that he wanted to commence with her, it seemed as though he wanted it to be quite meaningful and permanent. I'm not saying what he did to his family was right by any means. I don't want to say what he did to his family was psychologically sound, but I do want to say that it seems as though he did that in order to, in the insanity of his psychology, in order to secure a deep connection, to maintain what I think he felt was his version of a deep connection to Kissinger. Does that make sense? This article, and I'll put a link to it in the description, it's the Love in the Time of Neuroscience from 2014. It sort of ends off dealing with Johnson touching on what's described as the core aspect of human nature. I don't know what you think of this, but they talk about brain circuitry for attachment evolving over 4 million years, right? As our forebears inched into the open plains of Africa, and females then began to feel that, partners must protect them and provide for them while they carried their helpless young. And this is exactly the situation Shan'ann found herself in. She was, I guess, inching into the plains of multi-level marketing, right? And she was needing her partner to protect her and to provide for her while she was carrying a helpless infant, and also she was caring for two kind of helpless toddlers, and she was needing him to protect them. And of course, at the time she needed him most, he was straying, right? The article concludes saying attachment lives deep in primordial pathways in the brain, and Johnson's impressive work at commandeering this brain system to rehabilitate failing partnerships is an important contribution to those lost in the thicket of unhappy pair bonding. And so, you read about that, this whole thing about commandeering the brain system. How do you think, knowing what we know about Chris Watts, how do you think one could have gotten him to sort of, reattach himself to Shan'ann? How do you think it would have been possible to do that? And so what I want you to think about is, do you think that the answer to what was happening between Shan'ann and Chris Watts, now if you were either their best friend, so Nicole Atkinson, or you were some psychologist, let's say you'd written the book on what was going on, how would you intervene in this relationship, knowing what we know, knowing that he was cheating on her, knowing that he eventually did what he did? But if you could go back in time, what do you think you could have said or done to change things? And I guess what I'm asking you is, do you think you would have advised Chris Watts to stay with Shan'ann? And if so, what would you have said to him? Or do you think you would have said to Shan'ann, you need to not fight for this relationship. You need to actually give up. You need to let it go. You need to let Chris Watts go, right? So what I'm trying to say is, with the benefit of hindsight, what therapy or what advice would you give to either of them? And I think if it was me, I would speak to Shan'ann and I would say, Shan'ann, you need to get out of this relationship. You need to let go. Your life is on the line. Your children's lives are on the line. You need to let go. This guy isn't interested in you anymore. Do you really even love him? And she may have said something like, well, I can't afford to bring up these children, and then say, well, that's not a reason to stay in this relationship. You might feel desperate and feel desperately dependent, but you can't have that be the basis of your relationship. It's going to not even end in tears, it's going to end in graves, right? And, would there be any way to say to Chris Watts, Chris, don't pursue Kissinger? Do you think he would have listened? I think the only way something could have changed would be if you could wave a magic wand and show Chris Watts his future, sitting in a prison cell like he is now, all of that. And, that he wasn't going to get away with murder. He wasn't going to get his happily ever after. So if you did that, do you think he would have stayed married to Shan'ann, and do you think they would have lived happily ever after? I don't. I think, if anything, he would have thought, okay, well, let's see if I can get a divorce here. I don't think he would have, if he could see his future, don't you think he would have still gotten divorced? It's an interesting question, don't you think? Now, I think another interesting question that arises is with the Girl Wash Your Face author that Shanann's best friend was reading. She was giving advice on living, specifically on marriage. So what happened to her, right? And I think that is an important question. Nicole Atkinson was reading Girl Wash Your Face for inspiration in her life, and it was quite a good book to choose because it had been high up on New York Times bestseller list, one of the best-selling books of the year, I think. And so, how I came onto this particular topic was someone mentioned Nicole Atkinson reading a book by Rachel Hollis on the last weekend before Shanann's murder. And it got me curious about something. It also made me a little curious about Rachel Hollis herself. As a fellow author, I'm interested to know how her star came to shine. What was her secret of success? What was going on? And I think in a way, other women look at her and say, wow, you successful, you're happy, you influential, you're doing it, you're living it. I want some of that. I want to rub shoulders with you. And in a way, I think it's similar to what Shan'ann was doing. Shan'ann is living this picture-perfect life, and someone else like Nicole Atkinson also wants to thrive. She also wants that success. She also wants that colorful lifestyle. She wants to go on those holidays and go on those trips and drive a nice vehicle. And so you're getting an impression from someone, and that sells you on their story, right? And Hollis's message was, you and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. Now, take that message and apply it to Chris Watts. You say to Chris Watts, almost like, imagine Chris Watts is flying to North Carolina on the 31st of July 2018, and when he closes his eyes, he sees the message, you and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. And he's got still the sentiments of the sand dunes, those little sensations still flickering through his spine and through his fingertips and through his whole body of what that camping trip was like. He's still got those butterflies. And that message is coming through again. You and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. And he's thinking, you know what? I'm happy with her. I'm not happy with Shan'ann. You and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. Okay, well, you know what? I'm going to determine my happiness. I can't be part of this marriage. I can't be part of these children. I can't be part of this pregnancy that I actually am responsible for. You and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. And, if you think about that, I don't know. I think your happiness also depends on how happy you make somebody else, how you treat somebody else. I don't think happiness comes in a vacuum that, it's all about me, and what I'm getting. I understand that from the perspective of narcissism, and, there is a certain aspect to that where I think, for example, if you're a young adult, that you need to make decisions, you need to pursue certain goals, but within a marriage, I'm not sure how true that is. I get that you need to take responsibility for your unhappiness and for your situation, but it's not just about you. It's also about how you're treating other people around you. That's going to determine your happiness as well. Anyway, there's an article in the Washington Post describing Hollis's message as, quote, tapping into a well of female need. Is it true? Is this message tapping into a well of female need? It sounds like it is, but just based on her success. The Post also describes Hollis's call to arms as, quote, the non-confrontational wing of the hashtag #MeToo movement. It's either that, the non-confrontational wing of the Me Too movement, or Goop for Red State Women. So there is something critical in that article in the Washington Post about Rachel Hollis. The article is titled, Rachel Hollis has wooed millions of women with her book, What's Her Message, right? And, it begins by really just singing her praises, talking about the book as being a conversational self-help guide that mixes memoir, motivational tips, Bible quotations, and common sense girl talk. And just how it is basically, owned its spot on the New York Times bestseller list. It sold something like 1.6 million books, and that is in 2018, November 2018. And then it describes Hollis, a 35-year-old mother of 4 who had turned her lifestyle blog into a thriving business. She's a motivational speaker, a podcaster, a social media influencer. And as far as I know, it all started with her putting up a post about her stretch marks. And that basically was sort of like this moment of authenticity. Today, she's got something like 2.5 million followers on social media. It's probably even more since this article was written. 50,000 people tune into her daily Facebook live feeds. And apparently all of this started in March 2015 when she posted on Instagram her celebrating her stretch marks, and then it went viral. The YouTube video of this, from the video every woman should watch, has been viewed 461,000 times, and she's got 180,000 subscribers, right? So clearly a lot of women are caught up in this message. A lot of this message is resonating with women, and one of those women was Nicole Atkinson. Now, as a disclaimer, I've got to say I haven't I haven't read any of Rachel Hollis's books. I haven't read Girl, Wash Your Face. I don't know that much about Hollis. I've sort of glanced briefly at her Instagram profile. I've read the articles about her, so I don't really have a horse in the race. I don't really know enough about her to say anything one way or the other. What I do want to do is look at the scenario of someone like Nicole Atkinson, who was in a position to advise Shan'ann on her marriage based on what she was reading, right? Also, the fact that Shan'ann was reading a book, right? How helpful was this in their relationships? Now, what I think is quite interesting with Nicole Atkinson is she's reading this message, and the message is only you are responsible for how happy you are. Now, if you take that into the Chris Watts marriage, can she determine how happy Chris Watts was? I don't think the answer is yes. I think the answer is, her and Chris Watts determine how happy her and Chris Watts are, right? And his decision in terms of their baby is going to determine to some extent how happy she is, especially in a situation of children and pregnancy. It's going to be about the dynamic between the couple, not one person deciding what's going to happen. Now, I do think in a situation where you're a dominant person in a relationship, you can decide, I'm going to decide what's going to happen here. First of all, I'm going to decide we're going to stay together. Secondly, I'm going to decide this is what's going to happen. And thirdly, whatever. If you're in a situation where the other person absolutely doesn't want to be in that situation, absolutely doesn't want to be controlled, absolutely doesn't want to be dictated to, no matter what decisions you're going to make aren't going to work. In fact, by having that psychology, you perhaps endangering yourself. So far be it for me to speak on behalf of other women, in the non-true crime sense. What I do find heartbreakingly ironic is how Hollis and Shan'ann were actually playing the same game. What I mean by that is both of them were influencing other women on social media, especially showing photos of themselves smiling with their families, smiling with their husbands. Meanwhile, their private lives were a lot less rosy. So you have a parallel here with Hollis basically influencing her flock in the sense that, do what I'm doing. Look how happy I am with my husband Dave. Look at us here smiling. Look at us there smiling. Look at this perfect life that we've got, and be like us, kind of thing. And, buy a ticket to this, buy that. And it was actually, in reality, it was a lot less rosy than they were making it out to be. And that's a kind of influence I think women and men can do without. I think, if you think about it, if you think about Nicole Atkinson at that time, Shan'ann Watts at that time, being influenced by this particular person at that time, and now you eventually find out that that same, well, actually it wasn't that same year, in June 9th, 2020, Rachel Hollis basically said, look, actually our marriage is over. We started out as best friends, but it's not really working out. And so you've had this person giving out marriage advice, and then 2 years later she herself is getting divorced. It's the same thing with Shan'ann. She's giving kind of advice on how happy she is as a wife and as a mother. Meanwhile, actually, she's very unhappy. She's very unhappy in her pregnancy. She's very unhappy in her marriage. she's very unhappy with her husband. And I think it goes further than that. An excellent BuzzFeed article digs into this duplicity quite well. And this is a quote from an article titled "Rachel Hollis is out of touch with the times." And in this article, it's quoting Liz Faria, who blogs at A Mothership Down. Faria is also a licensed social worker, and this is a quote from the BuzzFeed article. Quote, Faria believes the backlash was so severe against the couple because they have been profiting off of the vision that their marriage is one to emulate, end quote. And doesn't that sound familiar? Remember Shan'ann saying, Chris is the best thing that has ever happened to me. Well, wasn't he the worst thing that had ever happened to her? That was part of the trailer in a Netflix series. Chris is the best thing that has ever happened to me. And she said it effusively. Chris is the best thing that has ever happened to me, right? And then, this was just months before he killed her. Wasn't Shan'ann doing exactly the same thing, except more that her family life with double bankruptcies was enviable and worth buying into? And this is going back to the BuzzFeed article. Quote, people have been following this couple and wishing their own marriage was more like the marriage between Rachel and Dave. This is something that Liz Faria is writing on her blog, A Mothership Down. The kind of fictional narrative presented as reality is harmful to followers who will never feel like their own lives are good enough because they aren't as, quote, perfect, quote unquote, perfect as what they see from influencers online. And now that Rachel and Dave are getting a divorce, these followers are angry because they rightfully feel like they've been duped. And so here's a fictional narrative presented as reality online. And, you talk about it being harmful. Well, was it helpful to Shan'ann Watts in the situation they were in? The other thing is, wasn't Shanann's Facebook flock also duped? You don't hear that, though. You hear about Chris Watts misled everybody and, he had this other face. There were two faces to Chris Watts. But what about Shanann's Facebook flock? And wasn't Shan'ann feeling captive because she told them all along that everything was, hunky-dory, that everything was going swell? She wants to do a gender reveal when her husband doesn't even want the child. How can she get divorced when she's been telling everyone how great everything's going? So doesn't that end up, she gets caught up in her own narrative? She gets caught up in her own fiction and she wants to perpetrate it, perhaps not because of her own feelings, but because of what she's been telling everybody else. But you don't really hear about that. All the anger is directed at Chris Watts or Kessinger. You don't hear Shanann's friends criticizing her for not being more transparent about the problems. You don't hear Shanann's friends criticizing her for not revealing what the true state of their finances were. And this is because of toxic positivity. Shanann's friends were all promoters, MLMers, thrivers. And so everyone's got to be positive, right? What happens when everyone is positive? Well, something really negative and catastrophic happened in terms of, her husband. And I think there's also toxic positivity with him, where he commits this crime and he thinks, well, I can get away with it if I just lie about it, if I just hide it away. And isn't that something that's going on with so many people? I can get what I want. I can, succeed if I just buy into toxic positivity. If I don't entertain a negative thought, I can kind of muscle my way into the secret, into getting what I imagine I deserve. Hollis has also been criticized for her inability to be vulnerable about what went wrong in her marriage. In her newest book, Didn't See That Coming. Does that ring a bell? Hollis has been criticized for her inability to be vulnerable about what went wrong. Now, don't you think that could help a lot of people? Is you say, you know what, this didn't really work. this was a mistake. This is what I learned. Don't you think that can help people learning from mistakes rather than sort of singing your own praises about your successes? And that is, I think, how the world works, how the world is wired. The world takes inspiration and envy from other people's success. There's not much lessons learned out of that success. It's just, I want that. And, if you do that and there's sort of an empty aphorism, like, you're in charge, what is that saying? You and only you are responsible, right? And so this is also a quote from BuzzFeed. In her new book, Hollis spends less time specifically examining her divorce. So in this book, didn't see that coming. Now, I don't know what she's really referring to. Is it the pandemic or is it the divorce? But ultimately, she writes it post-divorce. And her fans who were eager to hear about this didn't really get much details about that. So she doesn't really acknowledge her mistakes. She doesn't acknowledge the difficulties. Everything, I guess, is just easy. So it says in this article, Hollis gives very few details about why exactly she and Dave broke up. Don't you think it would be helpful to know, what went wrong? And I would imagine that social media had a big role in that one of them or both of them didn't like what the other one was saying on social media about them, or certain ways that things were portrayed. It says here in brackets that Davis implied on social media that it was his wife's decision to split. Now, if you take that, Dave implying that it was his wife's decision, and you take that whole comment, you and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. So let's imagine you in a marriage, you're in a relationship, and you decide, this is not really working for me. Then you break up, you divorce, right? Isn't that exactly what Chris Watts did? So isn't what Chris Watts did, meaning, him deciding only I can decide what's good for me, well, I'm going to get out of this marriage. And, isn't that not good advice? Isn't that advice, in terms of the Chris Watts situation, what really needed to happen there was a proper, honest conversation that we need to decide what to do here, so that we can come out of this in a happy way. And I'm not saying that that would be a realistic conversation. I am saying that had they felt, both of them, that they could have a conversation with one another, that would have saved lives. And in the same way that Hollis gives very few details about why exactly she and Dave broke up, Chris Watts didn't want to tell Shan'ann about why he wanted them to break up. He didn't want to talk about the affair, right? And so your happiness is actually, in a way, founded on, well, my happiness matters, but I'm not going to tell this other person what is actually going on. So it's my happiness at the expense of yours. Do you think that's fair? So again, quoting from BuzzFeed, after the announcement of their split, the couple were immediately criticized for positioning themselves for years as marriage gurus without any actual credentials, and for hosting relationship counseling conferences which cost $798 per person for early bird pricing, when their own union apparently was crumbling behind the scenes. And that's the end of the quoted section from BuzzFeed. How applicable, appropriate, and authentic is this message in that light? You and only you are ultimately responsible for how happy you are. Now, if you just think about you charging these exorbitant prices, just like in MLM that charge really high prices for products that you can sometimes just get from a healthy diet. Now, I must say, I agree with self-reliance. I support it. I think being independent is the best way for individuals to enter into couplehood and thence interdependency. So you start off being self-reliant, independent, and then you meet someone else and become interdependent. But happiness isn't ultimately just about you. Your happiness is also a factor of how you treat others and how happy they are because of it. Your happiness cannot be the principal aim in your life, because if we all pursued life that way, what does the person with you do? I mean, what does the person with you do if it's all about you? Is the person who's with you there to serve you, to give you everything you need, to give everything you need to make you happy to their own detriment? And once again, think about what happens to the person whose sole reason for living becomes making you happy. Dare I say it, like Chris Watts? Is the person that is with you just there to serve you? It just can't be that way. Two people have got to give their all to the relationship, but to one another. So I think this is another quote from BuzzFeed. Many fans asked how they were supposed to trust the advice of a woman who was unwilling to be vulnerable and honest about her own circumstances. Bloggers who reacted to the news wrote that they didn't judge the couple for the divorce. They did judge how the couple had portrayed themselves. And I think this applies to influencers beyond Rachel Hollis, beyond Shan'ann Watts, beyond multi-level marketers. It applies to, in a sense, all of us on social media. How are you portraying yourself? Are you getting caught up in portraying a fanciful version of yourself that makes other people miserable, and other people are doing the same as well? So everyone is trying to show how wonderful their lives are, and everyone is envious and jealous. Meanwhile, none of it is true. Selling a fairy tale tends to mean selling toxic positivity. Anything negative, any glitches are glossed over. Well, this is the stuff that people really need to learn about. Instead, they learn to hide their mistakes and fan the flame of the fairy tale, awakening the monster and the nightmare that follows. Now think about how all of this started for Rachel Hollis. She posts an image of herself with stretch marks, and then everyone sort of appreciates that she's being real, and then that becomes unreal, the fiction of the happy marriage, right? You have the same thing in a way with Shan'ann, her talking about, well, I have my bad moments and this and that and the next thing, but it's still under the umbrella of toxic positivity, right? It becomes all about appearances and positive appearances, and it means selling something that people want to buy, but at the same time, you're selling a lie. Even worse, it becomes about becoming a lie. Being authentic means resisting the urge to pageantry and performances. Being authentic means being real and humble, and yes, occasionally humble, without being self-pitying or blaming. I think what a lot of being authentic is about is not being authentic on social media. What I mean is, you can be authentic off social media. You don't have to go onto social media to show, to portray, to present, to perform being authentic. You can be authentic off of social media. And so if you think about it, it's almost like climbing a mountain and then not taking a selfie at the top, and then still finding value and meaning in that. Let me say that again. That kind of meaningful authenticity is where you're doing something where it truly means something to you, where the audience doesn't matter, right? And so it's like climbing, I wouldn't necessarily say Mount Everest, because I think you would be a little bit foolish to climb a mountain like that and not record the achievement. But I'm saying, if you do something and you don't record it for social media, is it worth doing? And you've got to find a way to to those experiences where you say, you know what, it's enough that I do this and that I experience this. I mean, is life more real because of social media? Are we living life vicariously through social media, or are we living life? Someone was saying, you know, we are living in this weird society where people prefer to mess around online to actual messing around, if you get what I'm saying. There's something crazy about that, and yet we seem to get some kind of, it's almost like there's more narcissistic supply in the digital thing where you get a certain number of likes. You know, it could be 50 for some people, it could be 50,000 for other people, but that means more to them than an actual experience with another real living human being that they know, looking into their eyes and saying whatever. And that real tactile thing means less than the symbolic reinforcement of, you know, thousands of digital people saying, oh, well, I like that, I'm impressed, or whatever. What does that say about us? If you're preferring to mess around online to real messing around. I think simply admitting that some things aren't great, but also not getting caught up in complaining about it all the time, that is part of being authentic as well. Shan'ann Ashley, writing on Medium, wrote the following, quote, "We're talking about two very influential life coaches," this is a reference to Rachel and Dave, "who've rapidly built an empire on tough love and being supposedly open books, yet they've been covering up the real state of their own marriage for years." And so, do you want to get caught up in the pretense, the fairy tale? In other words, in selling something that isn't actually true, but you get something out of it that's just really a feeling. Really, you know, for some of these influencers, they obviously earn an income out of it. But if you look at Shan'ann and Nicole Atkinson, they, at this critical time, at this very vulnerable time in their lives, they were allowing themselves to be educated, inspired by an influencer. And how did that turn out? And this is why I think the modern fairy tale culture is so compelling. You become influential by selling the lie, not by telling the truth. And isn't that a sad indictment of influencers? Is it a sad indictment of influencers, or a sadder indictment of the flocks following them? So, you know, I think by the same token, you can look at some channels on YouTube and say, you know, what is the way to become influential? Do you try and tell the truth? Do you try and tell the sort of basic thing that is happening? Or do you try and trick your audience, right? And then you've got to say, well, is the problem here the influencers or the flocks that are duped by them? Is the problem the trickery or the fact that people are tricked? Which is worse? I think part of the answer is both of them. I think the fact that it's kind of a dance, that you've got influencers tricking their audience and the audience being happy to be tricked. I don't think it's the one or the other. I think it's both. But I think when you have an audience that says, you know what, I can see what is actually happening here and I don't want to be part of it. I want to be real and you are not helping me get there. You know, you are selling fictions and stories and I'm getting caught up in it, but it's not really good for me. I want to be in the real world, right? What I want to encourage you guys to do is watch the video, Everything Wrong with Rachel Hollis. And I just think that expresses very well some of the things. I don't really want to make an attack on Rachel Hollis at all. I think what you need to do is look at concepts like toxic positivity, and I think the YouTube creator who does that does it very well. I also want you to see, I'm not in this video trying to accuse anyone of anything. I just really want to say shouldn't we try and be more authentic? Shouldn't we try and be more vulnerable in what is going on in our lives? Then in terms of the live stream tomorrow, I want to deal with your questions, your comments, especially related to the JonBenet Ramsey case. I really want to attend to some of the questions based on the audiobook that I've just put up on the JonBenet Ramsey case, the Craven Silence. It just was really quite interesting narrating that book and just going through some of the research that I put up about 5 years ago. So I'll also be announcing the next audiobook to go on Patreon, and then I'll be sharing some thoughts on the handbag. I put up a video about the handbag. I'm going to be talking about that again, but just specifically looking at what Nicole Atkinson said about the handbag to CBI agent Greg Zentner. And then I want to highlight something profound, something quite crucial in the JonBenet Ramsey case that many people have forgotten, that I think will shock and astound some people, especially if you haven't heard it before. Okay, and that's it. I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening. I hope wherever you are in the world, you're having a good weekend. Stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time.